and I guess that's still, we'll give it a couple minutes. We have some fast closers here, so we'll make up time on the back end, or it'll be so clear there won't be a whole lot of questions. So we'll eat, you know, we'll use part of that. Of course, the people on Zoom are all on time, probably sitting by anxiously waiting. Yeah. Okay. Give it one more minute. All right, we'll get started here. I'm sure folks will trickle in as we get going. Welcome to the very straightforward and predictable world of sediment assessment and remediation. That's a joke. That's probably one of the only jokes I'll throw out there. On that note, I'm joined here actually by 4 friends, which is unique. Not often you have 4 friends that you've worked with for quite a while, so I'm excited about that. For I guess going on maybe 4 or 5 years now, we're through ASTM. We've been working on several sediment assessment and remediation initiatives to try to clear up as best we can this not so straightforward and predictable world of sediment assessment and remediation by publishing, I think we're on our 9th document right now on everything from field technologies and field assessment to laboratory procedures. We've got ASTM sediment corrective action standards on long-term monitoring, on calculating background standards, establishing background reference areas for calculating background concentrations. We have a whole suite of NAPL standards on NAPL mobility assessment, on NAPL mobility, excuse me, field techniques for assessing mobility, to actual metrics to determine the mobility of NAPL and sediments, emplacement, conceptual site models for NAPL and sediments. So we've got several documents that are probably the best group of sediment remediation, sediment assessment, and corrective action standards out there today. There's an ASTM booth out in the vendor area. You could stop by, we could talk about it and talk to you about how to access those standards. There's a compilation with all these standards together, as well as all these standards that those standards reference. That's quite useful. So a couple of those standards will be mixed into the talks today, and Marcus and Mike will point that out in their talks. So with that, if you have any questions, feel free to come up and stop by the booth, ask any questions about those standards, and we'd be happy to answer them. So with that, we'll get going. Mike Gefell from Acker QA starting us off on NAPL mobility assessment and sediments at MGP sites using the ASTM Evaluation Metrics Guide. So, Mike.
Thanks, Tripp. And also thanks for leading our team so well, so skillfully, and for co-authoring this talk. So at many MGP sites, there are residuals of MGP operations that are present in sediment in the form of non-aqueous phase liquids. And so what I'm going to focus on is a new ASTM guide that presents specific processes, procedures, and methods to interpret the ability of the NAPL to actually move in the sediment. And as Tripp just introduced, there are a number of new ASTM guides regarding NAPL mobility in sediments, and there are 5 of them, and I'm going to provide a quick snapshot of them. And I'm also going to talk about what the motivation was for generating these new guides. And then we'll get into the evaluation metrics guide itself, and we'll look at some of the details about that. And then I'd like to acknowledge the team that contributed to preparing this new document. So in 2020, 2 new guides came out. The first one is about conceptual models for emplacement and advection. The second one is about sample collection, field screening, and sample handling. And then in 2021, there are 3 new guides. One is about selecting samples for laboratory NAPL mobility measurements and testing. And then there's this one that I am going to focus on in this talk, the evaluation metrics. And then the last one is about ebullition and ebullition facilitated NAPL transport. Sediments are unique. For the past couple of decades, there has been an evolving practice and a refined practice in evaluating NAPL mobility in upland settings. But sediments are different from uplands in a couple of key ways. First of all, the physical properties of sediments are different from the materials under uplands that have been compressed under an unsaturated vadose zone. Also, there are hydrodynamic factors that are different. In sediment settings, you can have rapidly changing hydraulics due to tides or due to flashy water levels in active river systems. And also, NAPL emplacement can be more complex, and there are different ways that NAPL can get emplaced in sediment, and that ultimately influences the mobility of the NAPL in the sediment. So you could have overland flow or direct discharge into a waterway, and then that NAPL gets mixed with depositing sediment. There is deposition of so-called oil particle aggregates, and there's also advection or flow through the pore spaces of the porous medium. In upland settings, all of the NAPL emplacement is by advection. It just flows in from ground surface and enters and moves through pore spaces that way. Another important distinction in sediment settings is that if NAPL is present in sediment, it's already very close to potential receptors. And that's different from in upland settings where you might be far away from potential receptors. The main reason why these new guides were generated is because previously, there were no industry standard methods for evaluating NAPL mobility in sediments. And so that's the main motivation for the new guides. If NAPL is present in sediment, and if you choose to undertake a NAPL emplacement and movement evaluation, there are a few really fundamental interpretations that you need to make. And the first one is about pore scale mobility right here. And that's about the ability of the NAPL to move within its current distribution. And there's 2 possibilities. You could have NAPL that is immobile at the pore scale. That means that it cannot move from one pore to the next. It's locked in place by capillary forces. Another possibility is that the NAPL is mobile at the pore scale. And in that case, that branches out into other criteria that need to be assessed. If the NAPL is capable of moving from pore to pore within its current distribution, then the question is, can it move someplace else? I mean, can that three-dimensional extent actually grow? If it can't, if it's trapped at the perimeter by capillary restrictions, then the NAPL is stable at the body scale. Another possibility, though, is that the NAPL does exceed the pore entry pressure and is able to push water out of the way. And in that case, it's migrating at the NAPL body scale. So there's a sequence of processes and criteria and terminology, and I'm going to use these terms in the rest of this talk. We call it the evaluation metrics because we evaluate and we use metrics to assess whether or not the NAPL can move. And by evaluation, we're talking about conducting laboratory tests and looking at the data, running calculations to interpret the results using multiple lines of evidence. And we use the word metrics because there are clear decision-making criteria that are used in the document. All right, so what's in it? The evaluation metrics guide has 11 sections. The first 4 sections and the last one are standard to pretty much any ASTM standard guide. The meat and potatoes is sections 5 through 10. And there's a fundamental framework or kind of like a logic flow that is discussed in section 5. And then we get into tiered methods and weight of evidence methods to assess whether or not NAPL can move. The guide also has information about laboratory testing methods and then calculations that can be done to assess whether or not the NAPL can move. And then there are also some qualitative tools based on field observations that can round out your site conceptual model about the potential for NAPL movement in sediments. Then there's 8 appendices with a lot of detail. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's more information about laboratory methods, and there are illustrative examples of how to apply tiered evaluation processes and weight of evidence evaluation processes using multiple lines of evidence to interpret whether or not the NAPL is either mobile or immobile at the pore scale, and whether the NAPL is either stable or migrating at the NAPL body scale. And there also are case studies that help illustrate the processes that the guide has. So let's look at the logic flow and some typical processes that are used in evaluating NAPL mobility in sediments, and we'll use some of the figures from the document too. So the logic flow is sequential in terms of the questions we need to answer. So the first one is NAPL present? There has to be NAPL present for it to be mobile in sediment. The next question, like I mentioned before, is the NAPL mobile at the pore scale? And if we conclude that it is mobile at the pore scale, then we go into a series of questions that help us interpret whether or not the NAPL has the ability to move at the NAPL body scale. Each one of these questions can be answered by collecting specific types of data and then interpreting those data in a systematic way. If the answer to any one of these questions is no, that leads to the conclusion that the NAPL is not capable of migrating by advection to receptors within a time frame that would potentially cause concern. So no to any of these questions provides an off-ramp in terms of the NAPL mobility assessment. One of the fundamental technical backbones of many NAPL mobility evaluations is laboratory tests of NAPL mobility. And typically the samples that are used in these assessments are taken from zones that have the most abundant NAPL presence. And so the guide talks about using detailed core photography under UV light where NAPL containing PAHs tends to fluoresce, and also white light photographs, which sometimes also show NAPL that is dark compared to the background matrix. The two fundamental types of tests are centrifuge tests and water drive tests. And they have different advantages and disadvantages in terms of relative cost and how long it takes to implement them. But both types of tests typically apply driving forces that are orders of magnitude stronger than the driving forces that exist in the field. And that is done so that the tests can be completed within a reasonable period of time. But because the hydraulic gradients in the laboratory are much stronger than they are in the field, that creates an interesting scenario when you need to interpret the results, because ultimately you want to interpret whether the NAPL is mobile or immobile at the pore scale in the field, and whether or not the NAPL is stable or migrating at the body scale in the field. And the evaluation metrics guide provides weight of evidence approaches to evaluate the data to make those interpretations. If NAPL is not expressed from a sample, that's straightforward. Then that means that the NAPL in that sample is immobile. It cannot migrate by advection. But if NAPL is expressed from the sample, that means that the NAPL is mobile at the pore scale under the laboratory test condition. Then you got to go farther to interpret whether or not it's likely to be mobile also under field conditions. And one of the first things that the guide acknowledges is that if NAPL comes out in a known period of time under a known hydraulic gradient with a sample of known geometry, that creates an opportunity to calculate the hydraulic conductivity of the NAPL phase itself. And then that can be used as one of the lines of evidence in a weight of evidence procedure to interpret whether the NAPL is likely to be mobile or immobile at the field scale or under field conditions. So if NAPL is mobile at the pore scale under field conditions, then the next question is the NAPL body stable or migrating? And there is a weight of evidence approach that uses multiple criteria that are listed here to make that judgment. The first of these is net upward gradient, and the simple diagram illustrates the principle. Let's say we're in sediment under a waterway and we've got NAPL right here. In this case, it's a DNAPL. It's got a density of 1.13 grams per cubic centimeter. And that creates, because of its density, that creates a downward driving force known as the hydraulic gradient due to gravity. And in this case, it's 0.13. It's basically the density contrast between the DNAPL and the water. So that's a downward vector acting on the DNAPL. Let's say there's upward pore water flow with an upward hydraulic gradient of 0.08. That creates an upward driving force. But that 0.08 upward driving force is not as strong as the 0.13 downward driving force. So there's what we call a net vertical gradient downward. So under this condition, that NAPL cannot move upward by advection. It cannot flow upward because there is no net upward driving force. If there is a net upward driving force, then we look at other factors. So this dark colored blob shown here is schematically a NAPL body, and it's within sediment, and here is the mud line of the sediment, and there's surface water above it. So the next question is, can this NAPL exceed the pore entry pressure at the top? That's what we would need for there to be a potential risk that the NAPL would move upward. And so we can calculate, based on the net upward gradient in this case, how thick that pool would have to be able to exceed the pore entry pressure at the top, push water out of the way within the pore spaces, and actually allow the NAPL to move. Another thing that we look at then is, if we conclude that it can potentially exceed pore entry pressure, we can estimate how far it could move upward before it depletes itself to an immobile NAPL saturation. And another thing we can look at using the hydraulic conductivity at the NAPL phase is, if it's able to move upward, what would the velocity of movement be? If the velocity is de minimis, if it would take 2,000 years to move up 5 feet to get to the mud line, that's important to know. And in a lot of cases, NAPL in sediments is essentially immobile. So I've talked about NAPL effective hydraulic conductivity, and there are multiple ways to estimate it. Using the laboratory test results is a quantitative and straightforward way. And it is used in 2 different weight of evidence procedures, one regarding pore scale mobility and the other about NAPL body scale mobility. So that's it. But I'd like to acknowledge the team that contributed to this document. And it was a big group of people from a wide variety of backgrounds, a lot of experts. And once again, Tripp, you did a great job keeping us on track over the course of the development of the document. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Oh, wait, nope. I'd be happy to not answer any questions.
I can cover that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I was pretty much given one instruction and one instruction only as moderator, and that was to announce that the questions will be held to the end, and I kind of blew that. So I got you. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. You were probably ready to throw something at me. So questions will be at the end, and also for the folks that are online, we'll be using the microphone. I think that there were some challenges in hearing the questions in the earlier session, so we'll be using the microphones for that. So thanks, Mike. So the next speaker, Marcus Byker, is going to be discussing kind of building on to the suite of NAPL standards, an introduction to an application of ASTM's new NAPL mobility and sediment standard. This is E3268, and this is primarily dealing with the sample collection and field screening processes that go into the laboratory, ultimately collected for the mobility analyses. So Marcus, you want to come on up? Marcus from Ramboll.
Thank you, Tripp. And I'd like to thank Tim Groff and Tim Olean for helping me with this presentation. As Mike acknowledged, this was a big effort to get these ASTM standards by a broad range of people. Sorry. Roadmap of where we're headed. First, I wanted to briefly review the ASTM standards that have been developed specific to advection mobility. Do a very brief talk on that since Mike covered a lot of that. Then I'll dive into an outline of ASTM 3268, which is the focus of this presentation. And we'll cover things ranging from pre-investigation planning to hydraulic conditions. And at this stage, I hope to discuss really what the content of the standard is, but also give some anecdotes of how to apply the content of these standards into real-world MGP sites. And then we'll close with some closing statements and questions at the end of the session. So, overview of some of the ASTM standards related to NAPL mobility and sediment. The first one that was published was 3248, related to conceptual site model development. And this has a lot of good content, as Mike described, about the differences between the upland settings and the sediment settings for NAPL mobility and how it may have gotten into the sediment and how that affects how NAPL may then migrate out of the sediment. ASTM 3268, the focus of this talk, discusses the sample collection side of the equation, and this standard is really well supplemented by ASTM 3281, which discusses a detailed procedure for logging NAPL presence in sediment cores and then categorizing them for NAPL mobility analyses. And lastly, the threshold metrics that Mike discussed was the last standard related to advection mobility. So an overview of ASTM 3268. The first 4 sections are the standard ASTM sections. Section 5 discusses NAPL mobility field investigations, and that's where we'll spend a lot of time in this talk about how to prepare for them and execute a NAPL mobility field investigation. Section 6 discusses the varying ways that you can collect a sample of sediment for NAPL mobility evaluations. There's a lot of tables in here. It presents the advantages and disadvantages of varying sample collection methodologies. We'll not discuss that much here. It could be its own presentation. Section 7 discusses how to log a sample for NAPL presence. And as I mentioned, this section is really well supplemented by ASTM 3281. Section 8 discusses sample handling, and particularly if that sample is being used to send to the lab for laboratory mobility analyses. And lastly, Section 9 discusses how to collect field data to assess hydraulic conditions. Now, moving on to an overview of the standard and how to apply this in the real world. So pre-investigation planning is important in the sediment environment as it is in the upland environment. So in the sediment environment, it's a little bit more complex though, because there's a variety of different ways that NAPL can get into the sediment, either from the adjacent MGP in the context of this figure. There can be an upstream refinery, a downstream industry, or there can be discharges through sanitary sewers, CSOs, and the like that can discharge NAPL to the water body from a much further point away from the sediment body itself. So it's really important to get a thorough understanding of the site, the different influences and contaminant distribution within the site before you're planning your investigation. So to do this, we're doing the same sort of things that we are typically doing in the upland sites, looking for fire insurance maps to determine where certain processes may have been located on a site and trying to determine how the NAPL that might have been involved in those processes is migrating into the sediment. That work is really well supplemented by trying to get some facility skeleton maps like the one you see on the screen here. This is one of my favorites. There is a tar tank here in the lower corner here, and there's, you can't see it on the screen here, but there is a tar sewer that's called out on the skeleton map that connects from that tank to the adjacent water body. So that was obviously a location where we had to plan some investigation at this particular site. Historic aerials can be pretty helpful, not so much in terms of determining where processes may have been located, but you can assess changes to the site and water body configuration over time. We've seen that oftentimes the MGP, there may have been a slough or a canal in the central portion of the site, and that was a primary location where NAPL was discharged into, and then that slough is backfilled over time. And that can affect how NAPL both is migrating within the upland site, but it can also affect, that's a primary conduit for NAPL migration into the water body. So knowing where that slough may have been located is helpful for designing your sediment investigation, and historic aerials, reviewing those changes over time can be pretty helpful to identifying those sorts of features. Lastly, municipal sewer records are really helpful to understand different contributions from the sanitary sewer system to your site. And you'd want to structure your investigation to understand the influences of those impacts relative to the MGP to determine what may be MGP related and what may be contributed by others. There's a wealth of information out there about the water body typically, especially if it's a navigable water body related to Army Corps or other permitting agencies, and you certainly want to get as much data from them as you can to either not have to collect certain data like bathymetry or just inform your conceptual site model. And one thing that I've been pushing for as of late is to really revisit all this work after you get your first round investigative data in-house. Oftentimes with an MGP, you'll have NAPL that's pretty logical in its distribution in the sediment, and then there'll be one or two outline cores downstream of the MGP, for example. And by diving into these aerials and the distribution, the fire insurance maps some more, you can understand what may have caused that by doing a little bit more thorough review of these pre-investigation planning documents. So once you've kind of done that desktop research, it is recommended, the standard recommends going into the field to do some reconnaissance work. And during this phase, you're looking to validate some of your preliminary findings, your observations of where you might want to collect a sediment core to assess its feasibility. You might want to understand if there's undocumented outfalls, no matter how well hidden they might be, like in that top photo. You also might want to assess the thickness of soft sediment to inform your what sampling techniques you might be doing. You can do this pretty simply by taking a pole, shoving it into the sediment and just seeing how far you can penetrate that pole into the sediment. While you're doing that effort, you can also, at a crude level, understand the debris that may be present, and as that might affect your sampling strategy. And you can also release some sheen from the sediment if you purposely are prodding the sediment up and down to locate locations where you may want to do some investigation. I should note that that is not definitive indicator of NAPL presence. There's often a lot of naturally occurring sheens in the sediment body, but it can be used at least to help streamline your investigation, to help you focus in a certain area. Some application of these concepts. So we've done a lot of work on the Chicago rivers, and in the South Branch of the Chicago River right here, there have been a handful of MGPs that were present on that river body. And right until about the 1900s, the natural flow of the South Branch of the Chicago River flowed up and into Lake Michigan after joining the main stem of the river. However, like most cities, right around the turn of the century, Chicago was growing, and the river system of Chicago turned into the sanitary sewer system for the city, and that discharged all those impacts into Lake Michigan, which was also where all the drinking water cribs for the city were situated. And so obviously this resulted in some human health issues for the city around the turn of the century. And to resolve these issues, the city decided to dredge the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal from here at the South Branch of the Chicago River all the way to the Des Plaines River, crossing a basin divide. And in fact, what that did is change the flow of the Chicago River from northeast to southwest during the course of the MGP operations. As you can imagine, the downstream receptors that were receiving Chicago's waste, like St. Louis, were not too pleased about this idea, and there was some litigation filed in the Supreme Court. But before that could be heard, the last scoop of the canal was dredged and forever changing the flow of the river. I am told that St. Louis did get the last laugh in the end, though, by sending it all back to us as Bud Light in Chicago, but that's just a matter of personal opinion. But in any case, what this caused for us in the investigation at these sites along the Chicago River is that for a portion of the operations, the water body was flowing to the east, and then the latter portion of their operations was flowing to the west. And so we needed to be mindful of the change in the hydraulic conditions as that affected how NAPL was migrating in the sediment over the course of the MGP, and design our investigation strategy accordingly. Another thing in terms of application of field reconnaissance, this is something that we have often done by taking field cameras, writing the rain notebook, and a field staff on a boat. They're photographing and logging what they see. Maybe that gets into a photo log in an RI report, but then that information is not really made readily available to latter stages of the project. And so with a recent project, we wanted to make this a little bit more streamlined. So we gathered key project stakeholders from FS engineers to forensic chemists, gathering the types of data that they might be interested in this reconnaissance effort. We programmed a Survey 123 form on a field tablet where we could record these observations during this reconnaissance effort. That information was gathered in real time, attributes were recorded along with the photos, and that allowed our staff to both see these observations in real time, but also allow this type of information to be plotted on a map and correlate these reconnaissance efforts with results of NAPL mobility testing, from forensic results and the like, to really inform the CSM in whether or not the reconnaissance observations may have influence or give some insight onto how NAPL may have gotten into the sediment. Moving on to NAPL distribution investigations. So once you have the pre-investigation plan has completed and you have a sampling strategy developed, then you're looking to assess the horizontal and vertical extent of NAPL that's present in the sediment body. At this stage, you are typically going to be collecting direct samples of the sediment that are capturing the entire interval from the surface of the sediment down to whatever the confining lithology is at the site. A vibrocore is a pretty good tool along this front, but site conditions might drive you to look at a different tool. Indirect tools like LAF or Targos are oftentimes used in this stage in the investigation, and then you need to correlate the LAF response to the direct sample results as far as NAPL presence, and there's a lot of good literature about that related to Gowanus and other sites. Once the core is collected from the sediment, then core processing begins in a field facility, ideally, where that starts with core photography, just to observe the original condition of the core before you start disturbing it with your logging activities. And then the standard recommends doing visual logging for potential NAPL presence. And during this stage, it's key that you use a really structured framework from least notable to most notable observations of NAPL. ASTM 3281 provides a really good framework with some specificity in terms of the observations from sheens to oil saturated, but recommend that you use that or some other similar rigid framework. Nothing's more annoying than having a soil bore in your sediment core that says MGP residuals from 15 to 20 feet, and you're left to determine, is that staining, is it oil saturated, when you're trying to inform a NAPL mobility investigation. As Mike had pointed out, it is often pretty hard to see NAPL in sediment because sediments are typically dark and the NAPLs are also dark. And so there is some recommendations in the standard to consider using UV light to help enhance that, and I'll be discussing that more in a moment. But because NAPL is so hard to see in the sediment, the standard recommends, especially ASTM 3281, that visual observations only be used to locate areas of potential NAPL presence, and then a secondary tool be used to confirm NAPL presence. One of the more common ones used is the sediment water shake test, where a sample of sediment is placed in a jar with distilled water and shaken around to agitate that NAPL free of the sediment. And in the MGP setting, the shake test will typically look like what you see on the screen there and coat the side of the jar. In less viscous NAPLs, it may present itself in blebs or layers on top of the shake test, but that is a good secondary assessment. Other assessments include using NAPL flute, which is a color reactive liner that you can place on the sediment. And then if NAPL is present, it will weep a dye on the opposite side of the liner, as you see on the screen there. You know, the glove tests are also an option in this state, but the real idea here is that the visual observations should note potential NAPL, and a secondary assessment should confirm its presence. I guess some real world application of these concepts. We have seen the value in UV light photography for informing NAPL mobility investigations, and we typically are used to getting those types of photos, like Mike showed out of his slide, from the laboratory when you submit a core to them for laboratory mobility analysis. We were hoping to get some of this information a little bit earlier in the process in the field, and so we developed, admittedly, a pretty crude prototype with duct tape and pool noodles, but it's a Rubbermaid bin flipped upside down with slots cut on either side to set over the sediment core. White light and UV light fixtures were placed inside of this box, and you could control them with exterior switches. And then a field tablet was placed as a viewing port on the top of the box. And what this allows us to do is collect photos of white light and UV light photos in real time, and by having that camera set on top of the box, the same scale and of the photos are always collected, so you can look at them and scale them correctly. And so some examples of what this can produce. A white light photo collected by this tool is shown on the top, and the same interval in UV light is shown on the bottom. And as you can see on this first core, there is not really any apparent NAPL visible on this section of the core, and the UV light validates there's limited fluorescence in that core. There is maybe a little bit of something unique occurring here, and the UV light validates that. And so in this situation, that would be an interval that you'd want to subject to shake test or other tool to confirm if NAPL is indeed present. The lower core gets a little bit more, the right core gets a little more interesting. You can see some NAPL appearing material in this area of the site, but then on this core here, you can see a pretty stark red fluorescence. And that is typically what we see when we're dealing with MGP type NAPLs, an orange or red shifted fluorescence. And that's what we observed here. And actually, some forensic samples were run on this and didn't indeed prove that that material was MGP related. But then deeper in the core, you see something interesting, more speckled distribution of fluorescence, and it's white instead of red. And we did some forensic sampling of that and confirmed that that was petroleum distillates. And so this tool allowed us to get some high quality photos, get some crude forensics information, and allow our field team to more readily adapt to observations, and also provide some validity to the locations where secondary assessments were collected to confirm NAPL presence. I guess a word about NAPL mobility investigations. And so once you understand where NAPL is present in the sediment body, then you really want to start understanding the continuity of NAPL in the sediment and how it might migrate out of the sediment, discussing a lot of things that Mike had presented on. And during this phase, you're typically going to want to collect a lined core and send it off to the site for laboratory analysis. Some notes on this stage of the project: you're going to want to consider the type of liner that you are using and whether or not it's compatible with the NAPL that is present at your site. Certain liner types can degrade in the presence of NAPL, so just want to do some compatibility studies on that. And also, you're going to want to coordinate with your mobility lab in terms of the size of the liner and the liner material type. I know that Eurofins Corvallis in particular uses the liner as an integral part of their water drive test. And so with them in particular, you're going to want to make sure that whatever you are sending to them and the type of liner and the size of it is compatible with their testing equipment. You also might want to consider collecting multiple cores at a given location, the standard recommends, because perhaps you might want to run a centrifuge test on one interval and then in the adjacent core, run a water drive test on that same NAPL observation. Maybe you'll want to get some hydraulic conductivity information of the overlying sediments to inform the pore entry evaluation that Mike had described, or just having a core on standby is always helpful, and it's easier to gather that while you're at that location in the field than remobilizing it at a later date. And then lastly, on frozen versus unfrozen cores, the standard discusses this in pretty extensive length. In the upland settings, we're pretty accustomed to sending these types of samples to the laboratory on dry ice to lock in those pore fluids. However, in the sediment environment, we're typically dealing with sediments with pretty high water content, upwards of 60% or so. In that freezing process, that water also expands, and so that can degrade the core. And then when it shrinks back, when it is unfrozen, that can create some fractures in the sediment that can cause potential for NAPL mobility that might actually not exist in the actual native sediment. What can also happen when you freeze a sediment core is that it can just lose its structure altogether. That freezing process and unfreezing, sometimes the sediment just loses its structure and turns to something resembling soup. And mobility test cannot be run on that sample. And so the standard does not take a stance on whether or not to freeze or unfreeze cores, but if you are considering freezing at your site, we strongly recommend that you do some trial runs with freezing of samples from your distribution investigation to see if that freezing does result in some negative effect of your core. And there are some metrics within the appendices of this standard to assess whether or not there are some negative effects of the freezing process. Lastly, hydraulic conditions. You also, as Mike noted, that the direction and magnitude of gradients has a particular impact on the likelihood for NAPL to be mobilized at a site and the direction that it might be mobilized at a site. And so there is a section 9 in the standard that discusses how to obtain vertical gradient information in the site, how to collect hydraulic conductivity information at the site, and how to determine locations of groundwater upwelling. And all this information is very helpful to adding to your robustness of your evaluation. I do know from experience that this is sometimes information that is hard to convince a client to collect, because in some water bodies, this is just challenging information to get if it's a navigable water body, but strongly recommend that if you're going to go to the point of trying to demonstrate the lack of mobility of NAPL in sediment, you need as much information as possible. And so strongly recommend getting this type of data. I guess in closing here, there are 4 new standards related to evaluating NAPL mobility in sediment in the advective pathway. And I guess there are more recently to ebullition. Two of these standards have to do with the field side of collecting data to inform mobility evaluations. And the goal, I mean, I'm advocating that all of us as the MGP community continue to use these in our sites. We're hopeful that if we approach these sorts of arguments and investigations similarly, using a similar framework, that the regulatory community will be more used to seeing this sort of data, and they would be more open to considering it when they are selecting the remedy for a sediment site. I guess that is all I have, and we'll take questions later.
All right. Thanks, Marcus. So that was a pretty good snapshot of the NAPL standards to ASTM. I think you'll find if you dig into them, they're set up like instruction books, very much how-to, and very useful, loaded with tools and decision frameworks presented throughout. What wasn't presented was the kind of precursor to all these standards, and those were the group of general sediment assessment standards, the very original ones on establishing risk, identifying risk, how to collect samples, how to transport samples, non-NAPL related, other contaminant suites, and ultimately leading to the decision of whether and how to remediate these sites. So that's kind of our transition in our session here into the last two speakers dealing with remediation projects, and kicking us off is Joe Smith from Anchor QEA on management of PAHs and NAPLs, adaptive management of PAH and NAPL impacted dredge residuals at a former MGP site located in Portland Harbor. So Joe, thanks.
Thank you, Tripp, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited today to speak about the management of PAH and NAPL-impacted dredge residuals. This is the Gasco site. You can see on the right here we have two photos. Oops, sorry about that. Using the wrong thing. We have two photos that came from an early action completed previously at the site. What we'll talk about today is a framework for future remediation work that we're currently designing, that we collaborated and coordinated with EPA to develop. There's a little bit of a rundown for what I'll talk about today. I'll go through the definition of dredge residuals. What are they? How are they managed? I'll talk a little bit about the Gasco site in particular. And then I'll spend the majority of the talk on the framework that we've developed and how we set clear endpoints for a post-dredge confirmation and closeout approach, and our cover confirmation and closeout approach. Before I go any further, I'd like to thank a few key individuals. Ryan Barth over here, give us a wave, Ryan. My colleague at Anchor QEA, Bob Wyatt of Northwest Natural is a project owner, and then Mike Crystal of Sediment Environmental, with whom we're doing a design build. So what are dredge residuals? We have two types. The first type is undisturbed residuals. I'll call them missed inventory for the remainder of this presentation. In the schematic, you can see we have two red blobs. The upper red blob is what would have been identified as contamination during your pre-design investigations. You can see that dashed blue line, which is representative of a dredge prism that would have been designed to get that contamination out. The bottom red blob, that's your missed inventory. It's just really things due to heterogeneity at the site that weren't identified. Second type is called generated residuals, and these residuals really are a result of the dredging work and are to some extent unavoidable. We know even on really well designed and constructed dredge projects that you'll have some of these types of residuals. So you can see in this graph here, we have on the x-axis sediment concentration. This is PCBs, so it's not from the Gasco site. This was taken from another project as an example to show here. And then we have on the y-axis depth below mudline. So you can see from this darker line here is showing the pre-dredge chemical concentrations. And so you can see that you have some impacts down to about 6.5 feet. And so you'd set your dredge prism at 6.5, 7 feet, get that contamination out. And then you had to have this pink line, which shows your post-dredge concentration. So you can see that there's a spike right at the surface. And that's the result of, just the sediment that was dredged, that as the bucket goes up through the water column, it falls out of the bucket and, deposits back and creates that post-dredge surface as sort of a fluff layer that has a concentration that's representative of everything that was above it. So you can see that it's sort of an amalgam of these concentrations that were removed. And as I said, we know that those types of residuals will happen. We know that once we go out and do the dredging at our site, that the surface will be impacted. We'll have some high concentrations. We may have some mobile NAPL. So we wanted to, get this out in front of the agencies early in the process so that they understand that these concentrations will be there, as we know. And we also wanted to take it a step further and make sure that, we know that these concentrations will be there. They now know that these concentrations will be there, but we need to know together what that means for our project. And so speaking of the project, this is the Gasco sediment site. It's adjacent to the Gasco property. We're out in Portland, Oregon. So this is just a few miles downriver of downtown Portland on the Willamette River. And because it is, out in Portland, it's really close to downtown. There's a lot of public interest, public engagement. There's a lot of tribal engagement, a lot of stakeholder agency engagement, very high profile project. We've been working on it for about 2 decades, a really long time. I actually didn't have a driver's license when we started. That's beside the point. So we've done an early action, as I mentioned on that introduction slide. In 2005, done an FS. In 2017, EPA submitted the record of decision for the site, which is a mixture of dredging and capping to address the contaminants. In 2018 is actually when we negotiated with EPA for the work that I'm talking about today during this presentation, which is before we did our data gap sampling. And that's important because we let the framework, influence and lead into the data gaps collection for our design. It's important because, sometimes if you don't think about residuals early enough in the process, you may not have the right, level of data, type of data that you need to be able to account for these residuals during, your construction process. So I'll talk through some of these framework goals for the site. And then I'll get into a few key elements and talk about those for the rest of the talk. So we had 6 goals that we wanted to, tick the box on as we were working through this process with the agencies. So we wanted to make sure that we had key endpoints so that, we could understand when we're done dredging and when we're done cover in our post-dredge condition. We wanted to limit unnecessary expense by, performing multiple dredge passes at that generated residuals layer. We know from other sites that it's really difficult to knock that layer down because of, the properties and characteristics of it being sort of that fluff layer. We wanted to be environmentally protective by covering our generated residuals as quickly as possible post-dredge to limit that potential for dispersion and movement of those residuals. At our site, we have a 4-month in-water work window. So we know that we're going to have multiple seasons of dredging. So we wanted to limit recontamination potential, both within, adjacent dredge management units within the same season and also among, dredging over multiple seasons. And we wanted to, understand if we do have any of the missed inventory type of residuals at our site. And if we do, we want to address them. And then we also want to just field verify to make sure, what we're doing is indeed protective. So now we'll get into a few of the elements. We have 4 specific elements. The first, again, is related to just having the right data density that we need to be able to, design a constructible dredge prism. When we go to do the actual construction, we want to make sure we're using the right equipment, like the right, environmental bucket, and also, have all the right BMPs in place to limit that dredge residual production. Then the last 2 are what I'll spend the rest of this talk focusing on. It's a post-dredge verification and closeout process that we negotiated with the agencies. And then also the cover verification and closeout process that we've negotiated. And I'll start with the post-dredge and then work into cover to wrap it up here. So we broke it down into 5 steps for this post-dredge verification and closeout approach. First, the contractor, Sevenson, will go out and they'll perform dredging within, the design specifications. They'll try to hit, the right target elevations and thicknesses. Once they do that, there will be a post-dredge bathymetric survey to confirm that those thicknesses and elevations have been met. If they haven't, they'll do a little bit more dredging until they have been met. And then we'll collect cores and evaluate for the potential of missed inventory. And so we'll collect about 5 cores per acre, prorated based on the size of our dredge management unit or DMU. And those cores will then be evaluated for the presence of mobile NAPL, and the chemical concentrations will be compared to the remedial action level, which comes from the 2017 ROD for our site. If we don't have NAPL or a RAL exceedance, then we'll close out that particular dredge management unit. However, if we do find in our coring, in our post-dredge confirmation coring, that we do have either NAPL or a RAL exceedance, then we'll go further and make sure that we have appropriately laterally and vertically defined what that contamination looks like, where the missed inventories actually are. And then once we know that, we'll do an additional measure to address those missed inventory. And so that will probably be just one single additional dredge pass. However, based on site-specific factors, it could be based on depth of contamination, proximity to structures, slope stability, things like that. It may be, lead to engineered capping. Then we'll close out the DMU. So before we get into the cover verification step, I'll walk you through what that post-dredge confirmation sampling program will look like on the next slide. There's a lot happening here, so I'll try to walk you through it. So you can see we're in the post-dredge condition. So we've got our existing mud line, and now we've done the dredging work. We have our generated residuals in red here, and then in green, this is what we're going to be evaluating for missed inventory. So right off the bat, once we collect these cores, we're pushing fairly short cores, just a few feet. We'll sample the generated residuals and 2 consecutive 6-inch intervals below that generated residuals layer. And that's what we'll use right off the bat to look at missed inventory. And so because there's a lot going on here, I'm going to spend the next minute or so talking through this missed inventory, and then I'll jump back up to the residuals. So let's just focus on the green for now. When we look at these first 2 samples and any sequential samples, we're evaluating them for mobile NAPL, but we're also looking at the PAH RAL concentration. We want to know if we're above or below that RAL. We're going to be looking at a composite basis over the DMU. So we'll subsample each core that we collect. Again, it's about 5 cores per acre, prorated. And if we have an exceedance, or if we find NAPL in any of the cores, then we'll go back to the archives of the discrete cores and analyze those discrete samples so that we can understand, on a more granular level, exactly where those missed inventories are. And the reason is because when we go to do our additional measure, we don't want to have to dredge over an entire DMU if it's really being driven by just one small portion of it, just recognizing that we might have some heterogeneity at the site. So that closes out the missed inventory component here. So jumping back up to residuals now on this top row, again, evaluating for total PAHs. But this time, instead of looking at a RAL, we're looking at this 920,000 ppb metric. And this is a calculated value that I'll walk through on the next couple of slides, how we got that to that value. It's essentially, calculated to be protective of a long-term cleanup level for total PAHs, which again comes from the ROD. We'll look on a composite basis over a dredge management unit. And And if we do have an exceedance of this verification metric, this 920 ppm, then we'll revise what our cover looks like. So post dredge, you place some cover to lock down the generated residuals, and we'll walk through now exactly what the post dredge cover at our site is going to look like and where that 920 ppm value came from. So this schematic sets up that calculation. Is a few things to note here. You can see we have our residuals layer, and then we have 12 total inches of cover. A 12-inch thickness comes from the rod as a minimum thickness requirement for cover post dredge. So you can see we have two separate 6-inch intervals that will be placed. First, 6 inches will be placed expeditiously after dredging. If you think back to our goals, one of the goals was to be environmentally protective and lock down those residuals as quickly as possible. So right after we dredge, we'll place first 6 inches, and then we'll place a second 6-inch layer at the end of the season. And the intent there is, again, going back to the goals, we want to limit the recontamination potential between, adjacent dredge management units within a given season. From the literature, we know that we should expect about 15% mixing between cover and residuals in the bottom 2 inches of cover. We've got, again, a 12-inch total thickness. So now getting into this calculation that I mentioned for the 920 ppm threshold concentration. It's a pretty simple formula. I'm not Mike Gefell here, so this is percent mixing times the mixing zone thickness divided by the cover thickness times the threshold concentration, and that gets you to a total pH cleanup level that comes from the rod. This is a long-term condition, so it's different from a time zero action level, like the remedial action levels that we would compare, our mist inventory concentrations to. So 15% within the first 2 inches of mixing, a total of 12 inches of cover thickness. These all came from the image on the last slide. 23 ppm TPH is the cleanup level from the rod. Do the calculation, the answer is not surprising, 920 ppm. And so that's that threshold concentration that when we go back, I'll actually just jump back here quickly. When we go back here, we're looking at this residuals layer now, and we're screening the concentration against that threshold. And that all factors into what this closeout approach looks like for our cover. So we've dredged, we've looked at mist inventory, we've understood if we had any impacts, we've addressed those impacts, and now we're planning to cover and close out this DMU. So if we're below that 920 ppm threshold, we'll just place 6 inches of cover. It's pretty straightforward. If we're above it in that first 6-inch cover layer, we'll alter what that cover layer looks like. So that may mean that the cover layer is a little bit thicker. It may mean that we add some amendment like GAC or organoclay. Sort of depends on what the concentrations are, what the exceedance factor is, and if there's NAPL and other MGP type of impacts in there. So we'll do that on a DMU basis. We'll repeat for the next DMU and the next DMU. And then we'll, at the end of each season, again, place that second 6-inch cover, as I discussed on the previous slide. So now we've placed 12 total inches of cover. We've met the rod requirements, but recognizing that this is such a high profile project, and to be as protective as possible, we decided that it would be prudent to place yet a third 6-inch cover layer once we've completed all of the work in all DMUs in all seasons. So really to wrap it up and tie a bow on it, and recognizing that there may be some potential dispersion of materials, within each season into areas that were previously covered with 12 inches, from a season or two before. We wanted to place that third layer of residual cover. So the key takeaway is that residuals happen. Like a broken record, I'll say it again. Residuals happen. We should account for them early in the process. Should make sure that the regulators understand what the residuals might look like, and account for it in your pre-design investigations, your design, and also when you go out and do the actual construction, understand what, what you might be able to do to limit those residuals. And so at the site in particular, Gasco sediment site, we negotiated with EPA and collaboratively developed the 5-stage post-dredge verification closeout approach and a 4-step cover verification closeout approach that we think and EPA and its partners think really adequately addresses those 6 goals that we had set out to complete. So, we'll be able to limit our expenses and limit time with yellow iron in the water. We'll also have really clear metrics, so we're not, kind of negotiating and arguing in the field as we see residuals concentrations, that might pique some interest. We'll say, well, we've got these, really clearly defined and agreed upon metrics, so we can close out and move on, while still being really protective at the site. And I think, the sequencing of when we place the cover and how we may amend the cover, based on that threshold concentration to be protective at the end of the day is really important for the site. And so we think it was a successful collaboration with the agencies. With that, I'll be happy to answer any questions after John gives his last talk of the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so you see a theme in the challenges with sediment remediation, especially in these physically active systems or remedial approaches, is just keeping control over the systems as you disturb them in your remedial techniques. This talk was a good transition to our next one. John Collins from Aquablock is going to be presenting some case studies on remediation of shoreline sediment sheens. So John, you ready to go? All right.
All right, thanks much. I guess to start off, I have an important observation here that maybe escaped the group, is that if you're talking about ASTM standards, you have to wear a tie and a suit coat. And if you're talking about remediation, it's okay to come up in just a shirt. So I think that's a good distinction here that I'm drawing. I'm going to switch gears. As Tripp mentioned, I'm going to talk about not only materials to help implement remediation, but also going to talk a little bit about specific case studies. As Tripp mentioned, I'm going to show some actual case studies. So the good news is that you get pictures. You get pictures of mud and other good stuff here going on. So the topics for discussion here, the problem I'm talking about, similar to what Joe just talked about, residuals in a different way, a little bit different way, but still the same concept. And as I mentioned, I'm talking about materials here. So I'm going to go through a little description of what those materials are and what they do and how they work, and how they might be integrated into different types of remedial solutions. And then I'll go through some of the examples as well. So the problem here that I'm discussing specifically, but relates directly to what Joe just talked about, is this concept that you're going to have residuals. Obviously the goal of any remediation is to eliminate the sources of contamination first. And in the case of MGP, most of the time, the upland work is done, prior to getting into the water, just to make sure that you're limiting, ongoing, sources of contamination. But there's also, residuals in the sediment, post dredge, as we just talked about. Overall here, we're trying to reduce the risk of remedy. We're trying to implement materials that maybe help you reduce the risk of remedy. These tend to be fairly significant remediation efforts that are pretty expensive. So I'm just going to talk about a range of different approaches that may help us accomplish that. So first, as it relates to materials specifically, there's two types of materials, and I'm not just going to talk about our materials. I'm going to, mention some other approaches as well. But as it relates to the materials that we provide, we have two different groups of materials. We usually separate them into AquaBlock, which is our namesake product, but that's a low permeability. It's a chemical isolation barrier type of material. The idea is it's going to stop migration of contaminants without also allowing water to flow or whatever else happens to be there. But then we have another group of materials which we refer to as AquaGate, which are absorptive treatment materials, and those materials remain permeable, so they will allow water to flow through. And you'll see that we use these materials both in combination or one or the other, depending on what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So this is just a quick overview of the low permeability material. This is again the AquaBlock material. It's been applied at a wide range of different MGP and petroleum related sites, as well as for metals and PAHs. This is a product that's been around now for 25 years and has been applied very widely. The AquaGate materials, on the other hand, are newer, relatively speaking. They consist of a range of different types of usually absorptive materials that are intended to remove contaminants as they flow through the water. And we have, different types of materials, always AquaGate plus whatever that particular absorptive material is that you're trying to implement. Could be activated carbon, could be organoclay, could be a range of other types of materials. But I'm going to focus for purposes of this morning on organoclay, because that's one of the primary materials that's used for NAPL and for sheen producing sediments. There is a little data in here about AquaGate plus PAC as well, but typically we use activated carbon for dissolve phase PAHs as opposed to pure phase or NAPL. So this slide gives you a little bit of, I think, really comparative data. If we look at organoclay versus activated carbon versus just native sediment or sand, in the case of the example that Joe just provided, when he talks about cover materials, generally speaking, we assume you're talking about sand materials. They have very little in terms of absorptive properties when you use those as cover materials. And again, the reason that you would use these types of absorptive materials is to reduce that risk, right? Reduce the risk that you would get any movement of the contaminants through those cover layers. So again, it's a risk of remedy concept. So we did some testing to take a look at organoclay in particular, and this was pretty interesting. We did a large project on the East Branch of the Grand Calumet River, and the idea here was to take a look at not only just the raw organoclay and how the material would perform, for a number of different contaminants of concern, but also to look at, okay, so we're taking that organoclay product and we're making it into something called AquaGate plus organoclay. And so how does the organoclay perform once we convert the raw material into a product? And then probably more importantly than that, so then we're going to take that material, we're going to drop it in the water, we're going to create, a layer that is intended to limit the migration of those contaminants up through the sediments and into the water column. So then the question becomes, once that material is placed, what are its characteristics? So in cooperation with Setco and Danny Ramboll and others, we went through a whole series of tests, and this data was collected blind. So everybody that tested the material didn't know which was which. Okay, they didn't know whether they were looking at the raw as manufactured product or if they were looking at a product that actually came out of the river after it was placed. So the data that you see here is interesting data. It basically says that once you place these materials, it gives you a high level of confidence that they're going to perform the way you expect them to perform. And we thought that was a really good data set and very useful for everybody. And there's also, KD values here, which are good for modeling if and when you get to that point. Okay, so enough about the materials. On to some examples. And what I did here with this approach is I wanted to talk about basically different configurations, different ways that the materials could be used and implemented into remedies as a way to illustrate what you could possibly do. So I broke this down into basically different approaches, what I'm calling approaches or methods where the materials may be applied. And the first one is something, oops, wrong button. The first one is something that everybody, I think, knows and understands relatively well, this concept of a permeable reactive barrier. And the idea is that, you've got some amount of contamination that's, flowing through subsurface. You don't want it to get to the surface water. And so you can put some absorptive material within a barrier wall that will intercept that contamination. So a couple of examples of this type of application. You can see here that this was a petroleum related facility where you had this is kind of the CSM. You had the contaminated material that was in the subsurface. There's a sheet pile wall that has to remain permeable because they didn't want to create an issue with mounding of groundwater behind the sheet pile wall. So it was necessary to come up with some sort of a permeable absorptive material to limit the contaminants from reaching the water body. So at this particular site, they had the advantage that they were constructing a new bulkhead outboard of an existing old dilapidated bulkhead wall. So it created, kind of an ideal annular space, between the two walls where you could put some permeable material in and that could be used to intercept groundwater. So as you can see on the slide, this has been, in place for a number of years and has performed very well. We did put this material through some pretty significant testing up at University of New Hampshire to verify that the material would remain permeable even when saturated with the contaminants. Yeah, getting too excited here. Another example of a PRB design was put in, we supplied the materials. We're not the contractor. We're not doing the actual implementation work. We're supplying the materials. So I always have to clarify that when I say we. But this was an interesting project because actually three materials, but two absorptive materials were used as more of a treatment train approach. Here was a situation where they were concerned not just about NAPL or DNAPL, but also dissolved phase contaminants. So we used they used a combination of organoclay and activated carbon in a basically a treatment train approach to remove both the NAPL first and then take care of the dissolved phase. The second approach I'll talk about is what we call a horizontal funnel and gate. And a lot of people are familiar with the concept of a funnel and gate as it relates to a vertical permeable reactive barrier where you're trying to push groundwater through a vertical PRB. But we took that concept and basically turned it on its side when we look at a sediment groundwater type of a situation. So the concept here is that, if you have some residual contaminants that might be coming out of the ground, you can use a combination of a permeable treatment layer underneath a low permeability layer. And the idea is that as groundwater and or contaminants move laterally below that low permeability layer, the contaminant is being removed before the water ultimately comes out from underneath the layer. This was implemented at an MGP site a long time ago, and this was very heavily impacted sediment. We placed the aquagate plus organoclay in a very thin layer. It was only about an inch thick layer initially on the sediment, and then it was covered with aqua block over the top of that, and then an aggregate cover material was placed over that. And this is sediment that, you know, was highly sheen producing. If you just touched it, you'd get kind of a bloom coming off of it. And I've followed up on this. There's no formal monitoring that's going on. It was all driven by visible sheen at this particular site because this is more or less a recreational side channel area along the Hudson River. And there has been no reported visible sheen from this area in that time frame. Another example of the same concept, the horizontal funnel and gate, is at a site down on the Arkansas River where materials were placed sequentially. First, organoclay was placed along a shallow shoreline area, and then aqua block was placed over the top of that. We actually did a number of different caps at this particular site using both aqua block and organoclay and combinations of it to take a look at what options might be available for more of a full scale implementation. And that is going to move forward fairly soon. Approach 3 is kind of what I'm calling a combined low permeability layer with other types of materials. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about reactive core mat, other types of absorptive materials. There's a lot of ways to skin the cat here, and I want to make sure that I talk about, you know, some of these types of projects and activities. This was an MGP site where in Massachusetts, where they had a pretty unique problem in that they had a historic wall and they had seepage of contaminants coming from the base of the wall down into the canal. And because of the steepness of the slope, of course, our materials have an angle of repose. They have to be supported, you know, if you're putting them on a steep slope. So this was a good application for a reactive core mat, which is going to stay on a slope, you know, much better. But they had to address the toe, basically the toe of this wall, and try to minimize the amount of contaminant that was coming out from underneath the toe of that wall. So it was you know, think of it like, you know, applying aqua block like a caulking layer across the top of that, or the bottom of the wall, the top of the RCM, in order to try to create a seal there that would force the contaminant underneath the RCM where it can be effective. So pretty unique combination of the materials and to fit the site related constraints. The last approach that I'm going to talk about here quickly, it was touched on in the last in a couple of the presentations before, is this concept of ebullition driven, you know, contaminant migration. There have been a number of different sites, pretty noteworthy sites. I think actually the Chicago River is one of those, but there have been a number of other sites that were characterized by that. I think that's more common. It's fairly common. It's fairly common at MGP sites because of the microbial, the biologic activity in the sediments that, you know, create the gas release within the sediments. This is a design approach that was actually created by RMT, is now TRC. And the idea is that you can use a low permeability layer in connection with gas transmission layers to try to redirect any gas flow that is created underneath a capping layer. There have been 3 or 4 of these now that have been implemented at full scale. This particular project is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at a former MGP site. And it was a situation where they did, you know, significant upland remediation, but there was still that residual that was contained in the area between where the upland was done and the river. And these were fairly impacted sediments. They did do a fair amount of removal of some of the sediments. The main river body is actually out here, and this is where some of the removal took place. But then they implemented this capping layer here, which was a combination of aqua block with gas transmission. And they actually installed some wells underneath so they could do some extraction. They could monitor actually what was going on underneath the cap and do extraction of any free NAPL if that ever took place. And you can see that this is the naturalized shoreline once the remediation was completed. So very, very successful project. Here I go again. So just a quick summary on the application side of things. Again, you know, the big advantage of these materials, I've talked about the idea of risk reduction, having some absorptive material in your cover layers that can address both sediment, you know, dredging residuals as well as the shoreline residuals. And you have a product in this particular case that you can handle just like sand and just like other cover or capping materials. And I think that's really important. It can be placed just like, you know, just like any other type of an implementation, remedy implementation. Quality control, as I've talked about, and knowing what's happening in the layers is really important. And we put a lot of emphasis on that. And finally, these materials, we all know what's going on in the world with shipping and transportation and freight related stuff nowadays. And so it's important if you have large scale projects to be able to do remote manufacturing and create the materials near the site that you're actually applying the materials. And that's something that we've done on a number of different occasions. So we think we can keep it cost effective even for large scale applications. So I guess in summary, I talked about the two different materials and the different types of applications, how they can be applied in a real world application. So that's all I have. Thank you.
So we can get your product by Christmas, right? All right, good. So that wraps up the talks. We definitely have some time for questions and answers. I believe we'll pass. Are we passing around the mic? Oh, okay. Yep, we have a mic here in the center. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. And for the panelists, if we can, I think we might have to click those on when time comes. So any questions?
So in regards to the ASTM standards for estimating NAPL mobility, the difference between the standards that are out there now that were developed a while ago for LNAPL, is the primary difference just this estimate of vertical gradient and the potential movement vertically? Or, I mean, are you using the same metrics for NAPL velocity to say something is not moving or migrating, or NAPL is not moving or migrating? So similar concepts, estimating relative permeability of the NAPL, but then if it's below a certain level, it's not moving. Are you using the same type of metrics?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at this one, Randy. So the vertical component of flow is a crucial difference for sure, that in sediments, we are most interested in the potential for upward movement of NAPL. So that is one difference. But also the ASTM standard for LNAPL is based on typically accumulation rates in wells, which are used to calculate transmissivity of the oil phase. And then based on the thickness of the oil phase, you can back out an estimate of the NAPL hydraulic conductivity. a difference in the evaluation metrics approach is the use of the laboratory tests to calculate the hydraulic conductivity of the NAPL phase. And that can be applied to basically any type of NAPL. What we find in subaqueous sediments is that when we put in piezometers, when we put in wells, it's extremely rare for any NAPL to come into them for a large number of reasons. Across many sites, I've seen only, I think, 2 wells at one site in one small area that had NAPL come into them in subaqueous sediments. And even when it does accumulate, it's rare to know the accumulation rate. You know you put it in, it wasn't there when you first put it in, and sometime later you're like pulling a transducer out and you find that it's coated with NAPL. So there are some key differences. You can't necessarily apply the upland methods in the same way within the sediments. It's part of the motivation for developing new standards.
Thank you.
Thanks. Question for Joe, actually a couple questions. So trying to understand on the dredge certification and going to the capping certification, you base your capping certification on that concentration in the residuals layer and then adjust it for thickness and mixing. And you have a pretty good number there by making that adjustment. But that's numbers quite a bit higher than your RAL. Is that could exist because you only have one redredge pass? Is that why?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So a couple of things. It's not capping, it's just cover. So we're
sorry.
not looking at, this is a little condescending, I apologize, but
No, it's an important point. Thanks for correcting me on that.
Well, that gets to the answer of the question, I think, is, we're only looking at the RAL for the missed inventory. So this is now the generated residuals that determines what our cover thickness and amendment looks like. And so it's not technically an active remediation. So when we look at the RAL, that's time 0, it triggers dredging or capping. And this is to be protective of a long-term condition. So we look at, what the mixing and, what gets you to that, 23 ppm, which is the long-term cleanup level. And so at time 0 after construction, we expect that, once you've addressed all the RAL exceedances, over time with, monitored or with natural recovery, you'll hit those cleanup levels. So if we can make sure that, post dredge, we've achieved those cleanup levels to begin with, we feel that'll be protective.
Okay. Then the second part on the cover placement, if you could explain that for me again, I didn't quite follow the sequence there. So if you looked at your number in the residuals layer and it was less than 920, you just went ahead and started placing the cover. What happens if it was greater? I didn't quite follow the sequence there.
Sure. So if it was greater than for that first 6-inch layer that's placed, right after we dredge to lock in the residuals, we'll either, increase the thickness or we'll add some amendment to that. And so essentially we, in the design process, are working through a series of, buckets that if the concentration, fits within a certain bucket, we'll have some predetermined, adjustments to what that first 6-inch cover looks like. And then the second and third cover thicknesses aren't amended. Those are just, a standard 6-inch cover.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay. Those are questions. That wraps up the session. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. And if any questions do pop up, just grab one of us in the hallways or in the exhibit room. Thank you. You're not too far behind. Trying to progress through, yeah, and it was going to be more, field that you were gradually getting the field and ultimately it should happen. So it worked out well. I think the order was good. But yeah. Yeah.
I'm always like circling with my mouse on G nowadays. Like it's hard to find the people and I don't know. I can't put the keyboard. Right. So yeah. 14 days. That's what I was about.
for water. It's the media for water. This is the right. So it's like it's measured flow. Based on how much what's on the that makes sense. I was hung up on it. What? Like the flow of water through the map? Yeah. I know. I was like thinking of a flex wall for reactor. What are you gonna fill it up with apple? And what are we doing here? Yeah. So I was confusing myself. Yeah, that's right. I was thinking about it. Yeah. That makes. I was gonna make a comment to you guys. We don't have to do any of that. We've already got Sheen. You got Sheen, and you pretty much know you've got something's mobile there, right? You don't never necessarily know how it's there or where it came from. You know it's there. Once it gets so Sheen. Yeah, that was the one that I mentioned in the talk. Format. It's not. That's the second. Yeah, that's the second. Oh, okay. Like that, did I also call that before? Oh. I mean, this. Central also sells the play mats, the mat, people mistakenly think that you can apply those in an optimal setting. You can't. That night, you have to. And once you drop water, that night's like a hydrate. And then once it hydrates, you can push it out. So you don't get the characteristics. So most, there's